There we go. Share screen. And I don't need these thingies, but we need this one. Oh, I think I jumped just a little bit to a new question from him. I left it myself a note and then I lost the note about where the timestamp was where we left. Very helpful, yeah. So so if this is redundant, let me know and we'll skip a little more.
Closer to your position than they might admit in doing
exactly.
Yeah. So, and I will let John respond to that in a short moment's time. I mean, let's just at least bring one of the issues that John brought against your position, which is, well, what do you do with your non-coercive, non-interventionist God, if you like, when you do look at a case for, miracles in the Bible? I mean, Christianity is founded on a miracle, a resurrection of Jesus Christ. It looks a lot like God intervened in a pretty dramatic way, at least then, in history. So does that count against the idea of this God who is very hands-off in terms of any specific actions that might contravene any human freedom?
Yeah, my God is hands-on, not hands-off. And I don't think there's a single Bible or a single story or miracle in the Bible that contradicts the view of God I've presented. And I also think God is in the business of doing miracles today. The big issue, though, is this.
Well, no, that one I just think is kind of weird, because the people I know, the process people who are, the complicated version of this open relational theology of his, what they would immediately move to is kind of modern textual criticism and just say, yeah, miracle stories. That's mythology. I'm not going to pretend I'm going to defend that. So it's weird to me that he would want to defend miracle stories with a God who's not omnipotent. So I don't. This one is.
Is his? I mean, do other people think like this guy? You chose him.
This is a very fast growing movement in especially Protestant theology, but also in Jewish theology and Catholic theology, and there are some Muslims who are working with these ideas.
How about the philosophers, not the pastorals?
Well, the theologians. This would be the kind of thing that people who are teaching in seminaries would be talking about and teaching to their students who are becoming ministers.
Well, what if you take a philosophy of religion class in an ecumenical university? It's not a theology setting.
Well, if they're really organized about it, they would get to this idea that, and then in current thinking, there are people who are arguing the other side of that medieval construction of omnipotence and now have given up omnipotence. So it should be something that's talked about. So
this guy is giving up omnipotence.
Right.
God is not all powerful.
Exactly.
And why is that?
Well, remember, so there's three, there's sort of three prongs to the problem. So it's that if God is omnipotent and so all powerful, omniscient, all knowing, and omnibenevolent, so we have the omni word, so completely good, where does evil come from? And so if you take away any one of those three, you can argue that
you can let in evil.
Evil makes sense somehow. Yeah, so he takes away power. So his answer is, well, it's not in God's power to prevent evil. The other guy is arguing about that God is not all good according to our conceptions of all good. And so evil exists because God's more complicated than we think God should be. Is sort of one way to think about it.
Sounds like he's making it up
well,
as it goes along.
And and that's sort of the nature of this game.
I could make it up as I go along too.
Yeah, the judge of theologians is, does anybody bother repeating their ideas? And so if people talk about them in the future, then they're influential. And I mean, there's no objective measure for these things. So it's,
it's like academics, right?
Well, I mean, if you're a physicist, you can
appeal the data.
The problem with
Unless you're a theoretical physicist.
well, then
you're-
that's true.
right.
Then you're then you're a lot more like a philosopher. So it's going to be that. But
All right,
so-
sorry.
so the criteria for critiquing any of these ideas, it has to be kind of internal to the idea. So you want to attack the logic of it somehow, or like Davis will say when he's making his critique of Roth is like that. Well, Roth is describing a God who sounds much more like the devil to me, and I'm not going to worship a God like that. Which is actually a psychological argument that it's just, this is psychologically untenable to ask me to believe this kind of thing. So you can have that kind of counter argument.
Right.
You could argue that the construction is just so far out, it's not connecting to the tradition either at all or sufficiently, because that's sort of another criteria that it would be judged with is the construction the theologian has come up with, is it actually speaking to people coherently who are part of this tradition? And then they'll recognize it as a
So
product.
if he gives up omnipotence, what is he saying about the Bible?
Well, see, this is kind of curious. He's clearly saying something more bizarre than I'm used to. So, because I know, but because I learned this from the most sort of complicated version of this. The process is definitely the most complicated version of an open theology. So and I think in the end, he actually has a more sophisticated view personally, but he knows he's speaking to a general audience, and especially a general audience of Christians, because this is a Christian radio station. So I think he's soft pedaling some of what he thinks to make it seem more familiar to the audience. Where the people that I'm having you read, these are very much intellectuals in the theological tradition, writing for other intellectuals, and they're going to give you just the most complicated version they can put up, because that's the nature of the game.
Okay.
So, but remember, so he's working with an idea of God who is present. So, and by virtue of being omniscient, is present everywhere, and that's the hands-on part. So he can talk about a God who's hands-on, who tries to have influence, but not coercive power. So he'd have to construct this in a way the miracle stories are the result of some persuasive power, not a coercive power. But let's see where he goes.
Do these miracles occur because God single-handedly brought them about? Or do they occur because there's some kind of cooperation by creaturely factors, organs, cells, etc.? Or is there some kind of conditions of creation that are conducive to these miracles happening? In other words, I don't think that, corks have free will, but I do think that there's certain conditions that God respects, to use language John likes to use here, such that sometimes miracles can occur because the conditions of creation are appropriate. So I do have a miracle working God. It's just that none of the miracles that God does are God single-handedly bringing them about. And I think there's no biblical passage to say that that happens. And I don't think there's any examples today of miracles in which God alone did them.
Let me toss it back to you now, John. Maybe start with Thomas's objection that your God isn't actually very omnipotent once you add all the qualifying factors there. And he used the well, I don't know what you thought of his squirrel example, but is it a divine version of the squirrel in the backyard?
No, I don't think so at all.
Oh, I think we skipped that.
I think Tom's comments obviously bring to mind that there are a lot of misunderstandings of what omnipotence is. If one thinks that omnipotence means God can do just anything, then of course you would have a problem. But the traditional understanding of God's omnipotence recognizes that even God can't do two contradictory things. So God can't bring about two logically contradictory possibilities. He can't give creatures free will that he does not determine, and then determine that they freely do what he wants them to do. And also, just to say God acts consistent with his own nature.
Okay, so the classic example of the logical thing is, can God construct a rock so heavy God couldn't lift it? I mean, like, when you start pondering that a little bit, it just sort of seems, oh, okay, that sounds like just a logical contradiction to me. And okay, so all right, I'm comfortable with the fact that even if I define God as omnipotent, that doesn't mean that God is able to contradict sort of basic logical constructions. So that's what he has in mind there. The other one, oh nuts, see, I managed to distract myself and I forgot my second point. It'll come back to me.
That is not analogous to Tom Squirrel. And
Oh, the squirrel, he was describing a squirrel that you couldn't see, but you wanted to believe it was there, and there wasn't really a lot of physical evidence for the squirrel, but you wanted to believe it anyway. So that it's not especially prescient. But anyway, the bit about the one thing that sort of puzzles me about how this kind of argument goes, and because Davis will make the same argument, is that God has to be hands off in order to allow free will. But that to me just seems sort of bizarre, that, well, what would stop God from intervening in earthquakes or warning people that an earthquake was coming, because the people then have to use their free will to decide how they're going to. So it's not, I don't understand how they actually think that because God is not using miracles in the world today the way there were in the biblical stories, how that somehow contravenes free will. It might if God was, manipulating people to stop moral evil, but there might be other ways to stop moral evil that don't involve direct manipulation. The other piece of this that none of these people ever will talk about is that, as it turns out, there's actually no evidence that we have free will. It's really it's a curious phenomenon. We all intuit that we have this thing. We have an experience that is undeniable, but if you go to examining it, there is no actual evidence that supports the idea that we have free will. And there's the best evidence. There is one bit of evidence that's used that because it's hard to find evidence either way, but there is one that sort of shows no, this free will is just an illusion. And there was a guy named Lippitt, psychologist, came up with this really clever experiment where he wired up people's brains, where he was tracking decision-making areas of the brain and action areas of the brain. And so he wires them up, and then he sits them in front of a little like table or something, and says, put your hand out on the table. Now, sometime in the next 30 seconds, whenever you want, lift your index finger, and so you're laying your hand on the table, you just lift the index finger. And what he finds is the parts of the brain that are responsible for sort of keeping track of the self and that we think of as telling the story that is our narrative, those fire, the motor thing fires, and then the self kind of oriented neurons fire a little bit later. And so it seems like, well, wait a second, what happened was the body does something and the mind rationalized that was my decision to do it. So anyway, so that becomes another challenge to this whole point of view is, well, what if people don't really have free will? What are you going to do with that? But they're not going to talk about it.
Can I just, in a New Yorker class I'd take, one of the stories we read, there's a philosopher named Galen Strawson, Galen Strawson, and he does not believe in free will. And you can find videos of him talking about it. And it was really interesting to listen.
Yeah, very, very important name. I reckon. Don't know we don't have any of his books, but I do know the name. Yeah, there's the way that philosophy navigates this is it invokes something they call soft determinism, which is just sort of like saying, well, you don't really have free will, but we're going to pretend you do. Okay, and there's some complex arguments about why they do that.
Richard,
yeah.
In this notion of free will, do they take into account how drugs can alter our behavior?
Well, when they're being a little more sophisticated, there'll be some of that, but it doesn't come up much in theodicy conversation, because once you've provided the challenge of free will, you're in a whole other realm, which they don't know what to do with anymore, because now that's a different debate.
Okay.
So, yeah, so it's just easier to ignore it. Just sort of, well, everybody thinks they have free will, therefore we're going to move.
Well, the other part of that is the evolutionary side. I mean, we treat it as if, or here are the animals, they don't have free will. And then we have free will, even if it's soft determinism and so on. But really, don't we have to look at, with all the discussion that's going on about when does even cognition come in, when does life begin, so to speak, from an evolutionary point of view, or it's really hard to determine at what point did the Neanderthal have free will, or, you know, when did we all become capable of that, and what happened before that is.
Right, very, very complicated conversations to have. Yeah, so it's, yeah, they just don't enter it. Okay, let's see, here we go.
Example, because part of God's nature is to be all powerful, that he can do all things. He is all powerful. Now, Tom, I think, suggests that the God on my account, there's a lot of things that he cannot do. But the main difference here is that it's not that God cannot do these things in principle, or that he intrinsically cannot do them. It's that he cannot do any things that fall temporarily within the jurisdiction of the enemy within this cosmic conflict. So these are temporary restrictions. That's one major difference. So in the end, God can and will exercise his power to defeat evil. Once all of the allegations have been resolved, once every mind in the universe recognizes that God is entirely good and loving. So these are temporary restrictions, and they are dynamic. So faith makes a difference, prayer makes a difference. The way Jesus talks about the demon the disciples couldn't cast out in Mark 9, he says this kind can only come out by prayer. So there are many things God can do, and I believe that God did in the Bible work many kinds of very robust miracles. My theodicy of love, as I lay out in the book, I don't have time to lay it out here, but my theodicy of love has a very robust account of God's providence. God is working miracles. He is acting in a very strong way to relieve sicknesses and maladies and all kinds of things. But when he doesn't, in the many cases he doesn't, I don't think it's because he doesn't want to. I think it's because there are other moral impediments that are temporarily restraining him from doing so.
And that would include the sort of activity of,
Which, and here it's worth noting, this is it's very odd for him to use sort of the language of morality when he's talking about contracts. You know, that it's how is it more moral to follow the text of a contract than it would be to save 13 million people in the Holocaust, you know, or 50 million in World War II total, you know, just like more morality. It's what? So that language just seems really bizarre to me.
of the realm of evil and those spiritual powers of darkness and so on. So give me an example of, I mean, it's very hard. Sometimes feels a little bit abstract and strange, but for instance, you know, when someone contracts cancer, and as far as we can see, there's no particular human reason why they would have done that. Would you say, no, certainly that's not God desiring that person to contract cancer, but at the same time, it's not just the random events of what happens in a free universe, that there is in fact a dark spiritual side to illness and disease, and that somehow God has not been able to override those factors. Do you want to sort of sketch out what that could in principle look like?
Yeah, so I certainly agree that God does not desire those kinds of illnesses and diseases and sicknesses. But when it comes to natural evils or evils in nature, I don't think that there are any evils that are purely natural, in the sense that I agree with Planting and others that evil came into the universe by the rebellious decisions of creatures, beginning with those decisions of Satan and his angels to fall and rebel against God. Now, when it comes to evils in the world today, I think there are at least two elements that are very important. So I don't make the claim that when there is a natural...
Yeah, actually, so I'm not aware of any respectable theologian in the last 300 years who would say anything like this, that rebellious angels and Satan talk. I mean, that's not been intellectually respectable, literally for 3 centuries, at least 3 centuries. So it's, I don't know. It's so.
But isn't it just
Anyway.
really, isn't it just really a Manichaeanism? I mean,
It is just.
I mean, that's the whole.
That's, yes. So it hasn't been Catholic acceptable for 1700 years. Yeah, yeah, you're going to argue Manichaeism, really? That's where you want to go. This is just, so, I mean, Roth at least is doing the modern version of it, which is just nature is nature, and, it just does stuff. God doesn't interfere because who knows? But
If God were all powerful, she wouldn't have any enemies.
Well, exactly. That's the fundamental logic where this one just seems to fall apart completely, and I don't understand how he doesn't see that. It's just definitionally impossible with the word omnipotent. Very strange, very strange. Anyway, this is part of why I study religion is I find this fascinating that someone would think this way.
Natural evil in the world today, it is necessarily the direct result of some kind of demonic activity. There are instances in the Bible where sicknesses and illnesses are attributed to demonic agency that Jesus casts out. So I don't rule that out either. But I wouldn't claim that each evil is caused in a directly proximate way by the free decisions of creatures. What I mean to say is that free will introduced, the misuse of free will introduced evil into the world that affected the way the world is. The world involves all kinds of evils and sicknesses and diseases that I do not think would be there if the world had remained as God wanted it to be, if every creature had never rebelled against God. I do think that there are some laws and forces of nature operating that God primordially set up for the best good of all creatures. And I think it's also quite possible that the cosmic conflict caused some of those forces and laws to go out of equilibrium, and that there are other kinds of things introduced that weren't there originally that are now part of the rules of engagement that God normally is not going to contravene for a host of reasons. And there also might be special supernatural activity. But I wouldn't try to say a particular illness or particular tragedy is directly caused by demonic activity. Sometimes it is those effects of the order of nature, what some call gnomic regularity, which itself appears to be necessary for a kind of consequential freedom so that creatures can make decisions and reasonably be able to predict the moral consequences of those decisions.
Okay, well, I mean, still plenty there for Thomas to, there's so many different directions we could take a lot of these issues, and time won't allow us to pick up on everything, but maybe coming back to you then, Thomas. So, I mean, what do you make of this sort of, the way that these other characters play into this? I mean, do you have any space in your own theology, Thomas, for the role of Satan, the powers of evil, and those sorts of things that obviously are critical to John's way of seeing how everything is playing out, and the way in which God is constrained at some level to the different aspects of the creation and what's going on?
Yeah, my theology is neutral on whether or not there are demons and the devil who exerts influence in the world. My theodicy can work if there is, and it can work if there isn't. So I don't need to take a stance on it, because the ultimate question is not that. The ultimate question is, what kind of power does God have? John wants to say that in principle, God can do anything, that's not logically impossible. And John wants to say at the end, God's going to make everything right. And God has that kind of omnipotence. This brings up all kinds of problems with why doesn't God use this power in the meantime? Why doesn't God step in to prevent the cancer that you mentioned or stop some rape? Well, John's got an account in which he says God, from the beginning, at least in these kinds of issues, decided to make a covenant with the evil one. God does deals with the devil, we might say. And God makes this promise based on this heavenly counsel and in relation to these demonic forces. And this promise involves God not, quote, intervening in all of these kinds of instances, even though God in principle could, but God made a promise at the beginning not to. I think this is a God who makes lousy promises. I think this God ought to break these promises in the name of love to prevent horrific evils in the world. Suppose my teenage daughter decides that she wants to spend, lots of time on the phone, like a lot of teenagers do, at least they used to before texting took over. But let's say she's talks on the phone a lot, and she says, I really need my privacy, Dad. So when the door is shut, don't interrupt me. I'm talking on the phone if the door is shut, and it's just part of the process of being a teenager. I need my privacy sometimes. And I say, okay, I promise I won't come in or even knock on the door if I see it shut, because I'll assume you're talking on the phone. Now, suppose a fire breaks out in my house, and I get everybody out, and I look out, and there my teenage daughter is not outside. So I run back in the house, go through the flames, up the stairs. I go to her door, and it turns out the door is shut. And I think to myself, oh, I made a promise not to go in if that door is shut. Now, do you think I'm going to break that promise in that moment to try to rescue my daughter? You bet I am, because I think love demands that I make a bad promise. I think the kind of promises that John lays out here, that God somehow allegedly made at the beginning, are ones that come in conflict with God's love. And God ought to break those promises if, in fact, God made them, which I don't think God did.
I mean,
That's where I think,
go
I
ahead,
think
John,
that-
go ahead.
I think that kind of perspective actually would bring you into conflict with your own position. So it sounds to me like you're saying that God can't prevent the evils in the world because for God to prevent those kinds of evils, God would have to do something unloving. But you also say in your book that a loving God should prevent evil when he can. So on one hand, you say it would be unloving to prevent those kinds of evils, but God should actually use his power to prevent those kind of evils if he could. So my question is, which is it? Is it loving or unloving? When it comes to my account, I don't think that God is making bad promises. And I think it's interesting that you would say God should break his promises, because that would itself be to do something unloving. And if the cosmic conflict is itself a conflict over character, you can imagine a different kind of story. So you imagine a mayor who's accused of corruption, and this mayor that's accused of corruption has all the power in the world to just completely squash any kind of claims against his government. If he exercises his power to do that, or doesn't allow the other agent to actually make their case against him, that's only going to exacerbate the problem. And so I think God, in his infinite wisdom and his infinite love, he knows, because he's taking into account other minds. It's not a matter of something that he is just agreeing to with the devil per se. This is taking place before a heavenly council, a heavenly court, which is very robustly represented throughout scripture. And so therefore the rules of engagement are far from ideal. But to the question as to why a loving God would agree to those rules, it's because there may not be any other way for God to once and for all settle this conflict in a way that will not
Yeah, so that this comes up a lot in these kinds of conversations. At some point, someone will say, it's a mystery. So this is it's a mystery move. We don't know. It's like, but I thought that was your job to explain that. So it's a weak move.
undermine love relationship, will not make other creatures wonder if God is a tyrant and end up serving God out of fear. But what I don't understand is on Tom's account, why God can't do the kinds of things that he does in scripture. Why would it be unloving to destroy cancer cells? Why would it be unloving to heal sicknesses like Jesus heals? I don't think that his account can actually satisfactorily address the kinds of evils that God deals with in the Bible. And I think my account has all the salient advantages, because I think there is a real sense in which there are things that God morally cannot do temporarily. And yet God can do all those kinds of miracles in particular circumstances. It's just that we don't know which circumstances those are. And in the end, more importantly, God has the power to actually ensure that evil is finally defeated and will never rise again.
So and I had a very similar question
This
for you,
is
Thomas,
crazy
which
talk.
is, given your criticism of the God who refuses to break his promises in John's case, isn't your God equally potentially on the hook for the fact that he has chosen simply never to intervene? Or is that somehow intrinsic to the way you regard God, that God cannot
Yes,
intervene
yeah.
in that way?
That's right. I don't have a God who promises not to intervene. I've got a God whose very nature is love that never intervenes. So it's not a choice on God's part. It's just who God is. It's God's nature. I like to sometimes contrast my views with one I think that's similar to John's and one on the other side of me. The one that's similar to John's, I call the divine voluntary self-limitation. God, either because of some counsels or rules of engagement or some promise, God has voluntarily decided not to intervene and stop evils, even though in principle God could. That's not my
Yeah, and
view.
you'll see the guys in the book use that language too, voluntarism.
It's something close to John's. On the other side of me is the idea that God is constrained by some sort of external forces, be they demons and principalities or laws of nature or metaphysical laws, all kinds of things. But God is like, I'd like to do something here, but God said, I can't because these things outside of me are preventing. My view says God's constraints come from God's own nature, not something external from God. But God doesn't choose God's own nature. That's just who God is from all eternity. And what's important here for your question is this nature is self-giving, others empowering, and therefore uncontrolling love. And so God doesn't simply choose not to control. It's just the way God acts because that's God's nature.
But you do believe, I think this was part of John's question to you, that God has acted through human means in kind of collaboration, as it were, with human freedom.
Definitely, yeah.
And in as much as that happens, what is it not unloving to if God can do that somehow for that not to happen sometimes in cases where, you know, well, why do I suppose the question is why doesn't, you know, God act when the person prays for that person to be healed of cancer? Is it that sometimes the cooperation does happen and sometimes it doesn't? What's the kind of variable?
Yes,
That's
there you
kind of
go. Yeah,
where I'm confused.
that's where it's going. Yeah, so God is always acting and wants to heal all kinds of cancerous cells, stop rapes, war, etc. But God can't do it single-handedly. So God has to call to free creatures, other entities to cooperate in some kind of way. So it's not the case that God did it one place single-handedly, and then you ask, well, why doesn't God do it other cases? God always acts, and there's always some kind of cooperation or not. And so when miracles don't happen, we don't blame God for not stepping in and single-handedly doing it. We say either the conditions of creation were not conducive, or there wasn't the kind of cooperation necessary for those miracles. There's nothing in the Bible that opposes that view.
John.
So I don't see how it would be unloving or go against creaturely cooperation to destroy cancer cells, for instance, or to say, work the kinds of miracles that we see in scripture. So you have God preserving 3 Hebrews in Daniel 3 from burning in a fire. You have an angel shutting the mouths of lions. And here, again, I think a voluntary free will defense has all the advantages of Ord's account without the negatives of not allowing God to be omnipotent and not having an actual guarantee that it will be okay in the end, that evil is actually going to be dealt with. When it comes to those examples, why can't God push somebody out of the way of a vehicle? Why can't God, even if you put aside what God is directly doing, there's a lot of kinds of evils in the world that God could prevent simply by a revelation, an advance warning. And you can't say that for God to do that would be intrinsically unloving, because God does those kinds of things in the Bible. He warns Pharaoh of the famine, for instance. So if you imagine, say, a tragic plane crash, if the plane crash is caused by a mechanical difficulty, for God to prevent that without undermining any freedom, without going against any creature cooperation, all he would have to do would be to actually reveal to someone in a position to fix that plane before the crash that there's going to be such a crash. And God could know that, even if I believe God knows the future, but even if he doesn't know the future, he would have enough present knowledge to be able to actually prevent those kinds of evils without coercing or forcing anyone. On my account, the reason why God doesn't do that is because, again, there are rules and parameters where God can reveal himself, especially in some specific cases, especially in covenant revelation. But in other cases, it would be against the rules. It would be unfair. The enemy wouldn't be allowed to make his case fully. But in your account, I don't see why God couldn't just alert someone in advance. And that alone would actually resolve a great many of the kinds of evils that we see in the world today. And all the kinds of miracles Jesus worked, putting aside the claim that they're not done unilaterally. If Jesus could do them then, it would seem that he could do them now.
Yeah, and I don't quite understand why he's not following the point, because he's clearly just doesn't understand when God's doesn't have the power to do these things. But like, anyway, so he seems he's bright, but he sees things, but I don't know. He's not seeing this is an obvious point.
In a sense, how do we really know what God did in biblical times? I think a lot of the stories that are written down were people's attempt to understand reality.
Yeah, well, and that's the modern. That's
But
what
we don't really know. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of things about Jesus's life were written down after he was dead.
Yeah, the Gospel of Mark is the earliest, and it was written about 70 years after Jesus died.
Yeah, so I think, and there is an oral tradition which could have been passed on, but I mean, nobody's got a tape recorder of what happened back then.
Right, and they also too, it's the way that people told those kinds of stories in the past makes very different assumptions about the world than we make living in a scientific world. So I think if you were to take someone who was early on writing one of the Gospels, say was writing Luke or something, and you brought them into the future here and pointed out how people were reading it, they would just be shocked that, like, what you think, what?
They thought the sun
We read that?
revolved.
What? No,
They thought the sun revolved around the earth.
yeah,
And the church was very resistant to Galileo's attempt to point out that wasn't true.
well, that's moving a lot forward. I'm talking
Yeah.
farther back. They speak in mythology. I mean, it's just we have a sense of literal that the ancient people just didn't have. And so when we bring our sense of literal into conversation with their texts, we're doing great violence when we want to impose that literality on their thinking. Because it's just not, that wasn't their world. So
they seem to be twisting a lot of pretzels of themselves. I mean, it's hard to lots of pretzels.
I have a question, Richard. Does this guy's view, or maybe even Roth's view, this direction? He mentioned it will all be all right in the end. Does this include the idea of redemption or something in the end times?
Well,
even though we can't understand this fight against evil and good, but in the end it will all become clear, and the good times will prevail. Does that include that view?
Oh yes. Now, and it's something that's kind of it's almost always there if you're going to talk to a theologian about theodicy. So that idea of final redemption is going to be there. They don't always emphasize it a lot, but they're all have it, and they're often operating with a kind of background assumption that they really want that to be true. It seems morally necessary that should be true. So it has to be true then somehow. And now the secret is to figure out how. Now, that just begs the obvious question of, well, why do you believe that has to be true just because you want it to be true? So so there's a lot, that's there, and it might be unstated or it might be made a little more obvious, but they're going to worry about that point that, well, does God, is there some way in which God is actually making things good in the end?
Well, and then in the book, the critical voices say, well, was it worthwhile, all this suffering that happened in the meantime? Isn't that a very inefficient way
of getting there?
Another one of the critics, I remember Renata was saying, well, that this redemption might be occurring on an individual level, but it doesn't seem to be accumulating as a society or historically with more than an individual. And then that individual has to go somewhere after, then there's that whole heaven. There has to be a good place. So
That is really where it was a good critique.
Yeah, and they will resolve it in different ways too. Like the process view isn't really able to preserve individual personalities.
Mhm.
So there's it's such a complicated view that there's these implications that come with it, and that's sort of one of them, that who I am as an individual person, that personality dies with death, but what biblical language calls soul, that process language would call kind of my essential monad, using Leibniz's language there, that the sense of the information part of that little tiny entity would be taken up into kind of a divine awareness, so that in colloquial language, my soul is going back to God, but in process's understanding of what those words mean, soul is not my personality, but it is somehow my essence. And so it's redeemed by having this, by this experience of going back to God. But if you're a bad person, then that's going to be kept at more distance from God. And so what's the ultimate redemption is sort of how close or far from God does the individual get in this afterlife, although life seems like a weird way to talk about that. So they're keeping, process finds a way to keep references to all of the ways that people are used to talking, but they've reinterpreted what all of that means in a way that fits with a much more modern understanding of the world and science and all of that. Anyway, so it's these ideas are really important to them, but they can become very subtle points as opposed to really obvious big hammers that sort of like the omnipotent people want God to have hammers to pound things, and process is saying, no, it's not about hammers, it's all much more subtle. So everything about the system gets to be subtle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. I don't think I did the best job on that one, but we'll be having more of this in the future too.
Yeah, I
well-
believe in miracles now, so yeah.
Well,
I think-
let me, I'll let you come back to that in a moment's time. We're
Okay,
already at the
sure.
end of our second part, and we'll have another 10 or 15 minutes to continue the conversation shortly. But it's Thomas J. Ord who's going to respond in a moment to John Peckham on today's show. Two different perspectives, two different theodicies, you could say, on the problem of God and evil. That's what we're debating today on Unbelievable with me, Justin Briley, and we'll be back with the final part very soon.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on the Premier Christian
Okay,
Radio,
Richard,
you'll enjoy the
I think I've
conversation.
missed this whole thing. So, so one of these radio people is arguing that God is arguing the process, that God is not omnipotent in a strange way.
Right?
Okay, but I don't really understand what the other person is arguing.
That God is not all good as we define that.
Okay, thank you.
And then it's just the implications of that.
Get this, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content, and much
Lost
more.
track of
Download
things.
the Premier Unbelievable app today.
So ads. That sounds bad.
Hey, come take a look at this. If you have a utility meter like this on the side of your house, we are looking.
There we go.
Welcome back to the final part of today's show, and it's been a really interesting discussion between John Peckham and Thomas J. Ord, with their different perspectives, both theologians and philosophers, on the problem of suffering and evil and how to reconcile that with a God who is good and loving. Thomas, John's view is this divine counsel, cosmic drama kind of view, in which to some extent God has chosen, as he says, voluntarily to submit to certain rules of engagement, if you like, and where we do see,
So, right. So, I mean, the point, so since this guy, the guy who's talking about is a kind of fundamentalist, he's operating with a much more kind of constrained set of ideas that have to fit in because of what fundamentalism wants to say and what it wants to insist. Roth, right, is agreeing with kind of the broad overview about goodness, but he's not offering this bizarre story about God making contracts with devils. You know, it's not. His answer is just that I don't know. I don't. I'm just reporting what I see. So he's convinced there is this God, and he's convinced of the ordinary portrayal of God as omnipotent is correct and ought to be correct. And that, you know, so there's some back and forth we'll talk about later. But fundamentally, it is just to him just this thing that's happening, and he's not able to explain it. And so you get a very different tone, you know, which he can do that being a liberal thinker. You know, it's I don't know what that's about. Whereas this guy is a fundamentalist, has to make that fit into a fundamentalist story. Because normally the normal fundamentalists would sound like Davis. But so this is a unique take on fundamentalism that looks postmodern. But so the reasons why they're saying what they're saying are very different. But in the end, they are saying sort of the same thing, that God is not going to be all good according to what we would think of as good.
And miracles and good things happening and answers to prayer, it's where, as it were, the battle has been won, and in places where we don't, it's where the powers of evil are currently winning. Ultimately, God will win, and all things will be put right. And I can see the attraction of that view, because it suggests that God isn't, as it were, your view is very different, because it suggests a God who never intervenes unilaterally in any kind of case. It's always, as you say, I'm guessing sort of in collaboration, in cooperation, as you say, with humans. Now, John can't see how that wouldn't still give God license to simply act in cases like he mentioned, where he could perhaps reveal to someone in a miraculous way that some event is going to happen. That wouldn't override their freedom. It doesn't. He can't see any way in which that would be coercive. So what's your point? And I'd just be interested in how you respond to some of those biblical examples he brought about, you know, warning Pharaoh of the famine or other things. Firstly, how much store you put in biblical miracles anyway, but how you respond to the way that they're portrayed in Scripture, which do seem to have God acting to some extent unilaterally, regardless of people's cooperation.
Well, I think a lot of people have assumed God is acting unilaterally in those instances, but I don't think we have to. And I don't think the scriptures require us to do so. I think maybe there's so many things I want to say in response to John's good questions. I think I'm going to really quickly go over 3 examples he gives and respond to them on how my view accounts for them. First of all, he wants to talk about God destroying cancer cells. I said at the start that God loves everyone and everything. And that means God can't control anyone or anything. I think God loves cells. And when those cells become cancerous, God doesn't utterly destroy them. Just like God doesn't utterly destroy people when they become sinful. So God's love extends even to the cellular level in terms of not destroying others. God works to heal those cells, but that's different than destroying them. John also talks about I can't read my own notes here. Well,
the one I'd be interested in is this idea of giving a revelation to someone. That wouldn't be coercive or act against their freedom. Yeah. So
in my view, God does act to reveal, but God never acts unilaterally to reveal. In other words, revelation always involves some kind of cooperation or lack thereof in the world. This not only accounts for why sometimes we do seem to have better and clearer understandings of what God is up to, but also for why we never can know with absolute certainty what God is up to. And it also helps to account for the problems we find in Scripture in which there are errors or contradictory accounts. It accounts for why today people have different views of what God wants done in the world. If God has the kind of ability to give a crystal clear, unambiguous revelation to anyone at any time, God's doing a really poor job of that. And God has been doing a poor job since the beginning of time. If, however, God is always working to reveal, but there are obstacles, real obstacles for us to getting that clear, crystal clear message. And we have to actually cooperate, listen metaphorically to God. Then we have a way to overcome this problem of revelation while still affirming that revelation can occur.
I mean, before John comes back on this, I mean, just to, take this analogy further, or the example at least that we've been looking at. So let's say, do you believe it is possible in principle for someone to receive a message from God, a revelation from God? A pilot, feels that God is telling them to check that pipe before they take off, and hey, what do you know? If he'd taken off, that would have caused, some terrible disaster, and that disaster is averted. And in cases where that revelation doesn't happen and tragedy ensues, is it because it is actually some factor of the human that they didn't pray, that they didn't give God the opportunity to give them the revelation? I'm just trying to understand what that would look like.
Great
in
question.
practice.
Yeah, when it doesn't happen, it could be a whole realm of possible factors. When it does happen, I don't think it ever happens because God implanted that information unilaterally. Either the person had some intuition, and of course, sometimes our intuitions are wrong. So that person wouldn't even know with absolute certainty that checking this particular thing is what needed to happen. So yes, these revelations can occur, but they're never God somehow doing it all alone. And when they don't occur, it's not because God isn't trying, it's because there's other factors or lack of cooperation.
But can God give direct special revelation? There's many accounts in the Bible of God giving direct special revelation. You seem to want to undermine that by saying if God can give direct special revelation, he ought to do it more often and make us understand him better. This is where I think, again, a cosmic conflict rules of engagement account helps, because I think special revelation is limited by those rules of engagement. I think there are special privileges in the covenant lineage for God to make his case within these rules of engagement. But in your account, it seems you either have to deny that God can give those kinds of direct special revelations, visions and dreams, the kinds of things God does in the Bible, or you don't have an explanation for why God doesn't do it to prevent the many kinds of evils that you say God can't prevent. Wouldn't it be more loving for God to do that? And why wouldn't God be able to do that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Both John and I want to talk about real limitations on what God can do and what God can reveal. I say these limitations are inherent in God's loving nature. God simply can't control to make sure that these revelations are crystal clear. John wants to say that has to do with God making a promise and these kind of rules of engagement. We're both talking about limitations. My God can't overcome these kind of limitations because it would go against God's very nature. John's God can overcome them if God decided to not do this particular rules of engagement, this counsel, or John seems to suggest that in the end, God will overcome these rules of engagement, or at least these limitations. So it's strange that I'm the one being attacked for having a view that is, I think, consistent with God's very nature, whereas John has a view that God decides to take on these limitations when God didn't have to at the beginning, and from some mysterious way, God is going to overcome them at the end.
So certainly I don't want to be attacking you in any way. But I think, for one thing, I don't see how it's any better to say God intrinsically is limited to granting freedom of the kind that's good for love and the regularities of nature that are good for love, and saying that God had the freedom to create a world voluntarily, didn't have to, and then freely gives that world the kind of freedom that is good for the flourishing of love. We both agree that freedom is good for the flourishing of love. I'm saying God does it voluntarily. You're saying it's involuntary. I don't see how involuntarily granting that is better. When it comes to God doing these things,
it's morality. The non-powerful God is not the one who's choosing to allow mass murder to happen. The morality of it's just weird. It's sort of like he's confused about what's morality about. But that is actually the benefit. It's the primary benefit of why process is appealing, is because you don't have God responsible for all of this evil.
I also have ways in which God is essentially limited. And you mentioned this as well in your book, that God cannot break his promises, right? He cannot deny his own nature. This is actually taught in 2 Timothy 2:13. He is without falsehood or cannot lie, depending on the translation in Titus 1:2. So if God makes promises, he's going to keep them. One can question whether God should have made those promises, but only God knows everything that needs to be known to make those kinds of decisions. And it's not that God can just unilaterally at any time do this or that. There are some things that even God can't do, not because he lacks power, but because to bring them about would be a contradiction. He can't make someone freely love him. He can't make someone freely believe that he is truly good and loving. Just like I can't make my wife, if I could control my wife's beliefs, this is why it's an epistemic conflict. If I could control my wife's beliefs, then she wouldn't be free to love or not love me. So if God is operating in that kind of a scenario, there are things God can't do with regard to the allegations, the other minds. He can't actually make it unilaterally such that they freely come to recognize his love, not because he lacks power, but because to do that would be a contradiction. So I don't see how you can say that God should break his promises, because that would go against the very loving nature that we both agree God has.
No,
You might want to say he shouldn't make those promises in the first place, but if that was the only way in God's infinite wisdom for these allegations to be settled once and for all, if that was for the best good of the universe, then God may indeed have morally sufficient reasons for making those kinds of commitments. And I think we have good reason to trust that the God who voluntarily dies on the cross suffers when we suffer, that he has done everything that he can for this world, that if there was a more preferable way, he would have chosen it. And we see even in the ministry of Christ, he seems to be limited.
Again, that's the mystery appeal.
Himself. There are some places where he could not do miracles because of lack of faith. Some demons don't come out because of the prayer. In the temptation narrative, there's all kinds of limits on Jesus' power, etc.
Quick response, Thomas, and then I'm going to ask a final question for you both that kind of hopefully brings the pastoral dimension of this a bit into play as well, because we've had a lot of obviously theological and important theological debate here, but obviously this is ultimately a pastoral question for most people. So but quick response from you first, Thomas.
Well, I think the first response John had was, why is it intrinsically better for a God who can't by nature prevent evil versus the kind of scenario John wants to bring up? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major reasons it's intrinsically better is because it says to victims of evil, survivors, that God just could not have stopped that from happening to them. In John's particular view, it sounds like, in fact, John says, God allows it, God permits it. And to those who suffer, that doesn't sound like very good news, because it sounds to them like God could have stopped it unilaterally. Now, John's got some caveats for why, that's not the case. But listen from a pastoral perspective. Listen, or try to put yourself in the place of a victim. Is it better to say God couldn't have stopped what happened to me, or God chose not to or wouldn't? I think it's intrinsically more valuable to those who suffer to say that a loving God was there with you but couldn't have stopped it, rather than saying God was there and allowed it.
But we both can say that at the moment of the actual suffering. We both can say that it would be unloving for God to stop it. It's just we have different reasons.
Okay. I think that's clear enough so far. Now I just got to figure out how I get rid of the
Reasons for saying it's unloving.
What in the world am I going to get rid of this? Oh, the stop share. That's what I need to do. Okay. So I think that they end kind of on this pastoral notice is important to the whole conversation, because I think I mentioned this when the first day. The problem of evil is, for people running religious organizations, the biggest problem they have, because that's the reason people disappear. They stop showing up. And if you want people to keep showing up, when bad things happen to them, and if you can't answer their questions about why these bad things happen to them, they go away. They stop believing in whatever message the religion was trying to teach them. So, and we know this from sociology. This is very real, as well as from anecdotal accounts by clergy across the spectrum. So in the end, there is a big part of this conversation that's going to kind of circle around human psychology in some ways, because one of the things they're up to is to try and be satisfying to people. And one of the big reasons they would all, in the case, probably these guys, but definitely the people in the book, they would say that they're all Christians. The reason they're religious is because they think that it's psychologically important for them to believe in a universe that has this redemptive feature to it somehow. And when you push them about details, then they're going to go all over the place about how they're going to tell a story that makes that all psychologically comfortable to try to be intellectually coherent with their psychological comfort. But in the end, that's that's the reason to have the conversation, is that you need to address that human psychology somehow. And they're just convinced that atheism is just not a psychologically helpful answer. Jen?
So from the pastoral point of view, then what wouldn't the religions that have dualistic gods, like Manichaeism or Zoroastrianism or any, have gained more traction? Is it just because Christianity pushed them out?
Well, it's logically problematic is the reason. So once the church rejects Manichaeism kind of early on for a number of reasons, but when you start getting into going forward in history enough that you can have proper constructions of omnipotent power, it just becomes logically incoherent to argue that way, which is my problem with the guy on the show, is that it just seems logically incoherent to me. So in all of that, you still have those kinds of limitations, is like, well, wait a second, I can't say that I believe God is all powerful and at the same time hold on to an older version of a story that seemed psychologically comfortable but doesn't fit with this new construct. So those systems tend to be historic rather than contemporary, although there are people who still believe versions of it, but it dies out over time because the logic challenges it too much. You just can't have two sources of power and have one of them seem to be all powerful and yet there's somehow room for another power. So it fades away for that kind of logical reason. But it's popular historically because it does satisfy kind of that psychological sense. Think about it all starts with the animists, and their solution to this problem is, well, some of the spirits are just malicious and some of them are not. They're helpful to us, and I can't. It's not me as a human to be able to do anything other than to try and figure out which one is which and try to avoid the bad ones and encourage relationships with the good ones. So we start the history of religions as human beings with that very basic idea that we're going to explain bad things with an appeal to power the same way we're going to explain good things with an appeal to power. And then we go forward in time, and it just, as religions develop and become more logically kind of systematic and coherent, you just have to give up at some point to maintain that logical consistency. You give up that other power. So it's this is, and again, people do still believe these things, but they're always intellectually, and although this sounds arrogant, doesn't it? Always intellectually backwards. It's not, they're generally come out of places and views where people don't know much about the world. They just don't have an exposure to higher education. And so they're not encountering a complexity that where logic matters. And so if you don't live in a world that logic matters to, because you just don't take it seriously enough intellectually, then it's okay to believe things that aren't really logically coherent. This, which is sort of the appeal which is the the reason Roth's view has traction in the world today is that he avoids that appeal to something that's not logical by just pleading ignorant and saying, okay, I'm going to be comfortable with my ignorance. This is what I see. I see divine power, but I see bad things. I don't know how to explain it. So it seems like clearly that divine power is allowing these bad things for reasons I can't explain. Mm-hmm.
I was interested in one little point that second speaker there on the video made when he was talking about cancer. Mm-hmm. And God is taking into account also, I mean, I'm paraphrasing this badly, but like the cells, mm-hmm. You know, in order to save the individual, you have to destroy the cells if you have an intervention or something. But I think it really speaks to, doesn't it, kind of also a certain relativism about looking at evil. We have a pretty strong perspective on most things. And of course, it seems very clear when you have mass evil, but look at the aspect of intervention, a situation where here is a person controlling drone strikes, let's say, in some war situation, you know, and you could reasonably argue, and people do argue, is it defensible to initiate a drone strike, which might prevent further aggression of our, you know, enemies, or is this killing of innocent people or something? And maybe in biblical times, these definitions would have been clearer. You know, it's always bad if the actions that you could do in terms of clobbering somebody to death or something was clearly a killing and so on. But what about modern day actions? I was just saying it was interesting that he brought this up, and the other guy didn't. What would this first guy be saying about that? He seems to be so very clear on, you know, like the revelation part and so on, that there's a very clear system of what's right to do and what not.
Right, the fundamentalist guy, his version of that would just prioritize humans. So he wouldn't talk the same about God loving the whole.
Of course not. But what about in these complex situations that I mentioned in terms of a war scenario and so on? Now that might be odd too, because war, of course, in that system would also not ever be justified. But aren't there complex situations that defy an easy answer in terms of?
Oh, certainly. Well, now, yes. And what I think would be good to keep in mind here is that we also in our world today think about morality very differently than people did in the ancient world. You know, so the view that the term that's often used for that view, and it still has resonances among some people today, but in the culture generally, no. But it's called divine command theory, right? So that the idea is that right and wrong, moral right and moral wrong are defined by the commandments that God gives. And in the modern world, especially post-enlightenment, we have a very different sense that morality is something that has to do with universalizing our decisions along the lines that Kant would lay out. We call deontological, that you're following this very important principle, or it's about the consequences that you're producing, right? We call that teleological, people like utilitarians. But we in the modern world reason our way to ethics. In the ancient world, it's a matter of what does someone higher than me in the social hierarchy tell me is right and wrong, with the ultimate voice being God's, presumably, but right, God's voice is coming through someone, so that's usually said someone higher than you in that social hierarchy. So what's right is what the king said. So if the king says it's right, it's right. King says we go to war, we go to war. So what's your just war theory? Did the king order it or not? You know, and that's so that kind of approach to ethics can be a lot simpler than
Yeah,
our
sure.
modern problems when we try to understand morality, because it's not what we would call morality. That's just following orders, and we've decided in our world, especially post Nuremberg trials, that following orders is not a good answer to a moral question. So that's a big, I think it's good to understand too that we today are bringing in more sophisticated challenges and questions to theodicy than ancient people would have ever navigated, which is part of why the fundamentalist seems bizarre, is because it's so out of step with Enlightenment thinking. Okay. Let's see, I did want to wrap this up so we can move on. So I want to just mention a couple of things I think that came out in the chapter here. Now it is very important for Roth's case here that he's calling this a theodicy of protest, right? And that's where he's in line with Jewish thought on these kinds of questions. That there's a long history of Jewish responses to these kinds of questions to just be angry at God, and Judaism has a curious space for that kind of language and even emotion that Christianity doesn't have, mostly because the tradition of popes is too much like a tradition of emperors and kings, and you shouldn't get angry at the king or the emperor. But because Judaism didn't have state power, it navigates a lot of ideas in slightly different ways than Christianity because of that kind of political history. So there is this long history of Jews having this attitude that it's just a matter of what the hell is God doing? What are you thinking? And you shake your fist and you get angry at God. What he's doing is offering an intellectual construct of that's highly informed by him being a philosopher who's trained in the latter half of the 20th century and is comfortable with this postmodern culture I was trying to teach you a little bit about earlier, that embraces relativism and unknowability. So for him, because he's starting with this kind of base philosophical view that reality itself is fundamentally mysterious to us, and that's not an incoherent thought. I mean, the reasons why postmodernism was very popular for a good 30 or 40 years in the academy. We all do have different points of view, and trying to figure out which point of view is right and triangulating all that's a very complicated thing. And so on the face of it, it can often seem that, well, it's just reality just seems different to different people. And so there isn't really one, it's multifaceted. So there's lots of things that aren't knowable. And so it just makes, to him, it's a quite reasonable thought then that, well, God is one of those things in the universe, one aspect of the universe that's just unknowable. And so I'm not going to know why these kinds of evil things happen in terms of what God's up to. But I can and should be frustrated, and I should protest those things, and I can be angry at God that this is happening, even if I'm accepting that God is allowing them.
But there is more, I mean, a bigger picture than just logic and reason. And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that, because we came after the Enlightenment, many people poo-poo the mystery or the divine without, and yet if I told you, this table that I'm knocking on is mostly empty air, people say, well, no, that can't be true. But of course, when we drill down into quantum, it is true. And so the unknowability seems perfectly reasonable to me. And the really fundamentalist guy, he just kept talking faster and faster and faster. And it must be terrible to need to put it all in a box. See, like I told you last week, I'm a mystery girl. So
Right, and so that is also a big part of that postmodern view, right? Is it like, and I like the way you just said that. Is Roth can bring that back? Is like, why do you think everything has to fit into one neat box?
Exactly.
Like, why
Exactly.
where is that assumption coming from? So that's yeah, that is definitely a big idea in postmodern thought, and
Yeah.
it fits in perfectly well. I mean, that's what I hope you will appreciate along the way is that each of these people is very consistent logically in how they think and what they say. We may not, I may not agree with much of what they say, but I definitely appreciate the logical consistency with which they bring to bear in saying it. And Roth, right off the bat, showing us a perfectly logically consistent presentation of his thinking. All you have to know are some of the background things he's assuming, and it's like, oh yeah, of course, he's a postmodernist. That's yeah, well, oh yeah, okay, yeah, there you go. Makes sense. Now, then you get to the critiques, and that's where you get the, okay, like, someone said, no, maybe it actually was you, Nancy. There's more things. More in the story, and so one of the things becomes then this psychological piece, and that's where a number of them are going to go in their critique to him, is that this is not psychologically sustainable. I can appreciate the logical construction, but I don't think I personally could sell this to anyone. So,
including myself, it's like with the guy talking faster and faster, it's like I'm dancing as fast as I can kind of thing. and I still think I'm probably not believing everything that's coming out of my mouth.
Well, there you go. Okay, so let's see, what do we want to say here? So on page 22, anyway, this is Davis. Near the bottom, he says, if God is, as Roth says, a grossly negligent murderer, I will no more worship God than I will worship a Caligula or a Stalin. And so that's psychological critique coming in, is that what is it you're asking me to do in this story? But for Roth, this makes sense, because he's just putting these things in different boxes, and my moral concerns about God just have to go in a different box, and Davis wants to put them in the same box, which is what a systematic thinker is likely to do, which is why the postmodernists challenge systematic thinking. So let's see, top 23. Evil will not have been legitimated, only defeated, redeemed, and overcome. Which is sort of his way of saying that it seems to, I think it's this kind of view seems to legitimate evil now, so I think this is kind of Davis's way of making the same kind of point about what are you going to say to the victim, and how is that actually going to be helpful to that person, while still seeming to be sort of true and consistent and all of those other things. Yeah, and actually he even uses more specific language in the next paragraph. He thinks the approach is this: to embrace such schemes is to fail to have solidarity with the victims and sufferers. Let's see here. Okay, and then DZ Phillips, the next one. Phillips, did I mention the name Wittgenstein yet?
Oh,
maybe not. Okay, so there's this very important, I think, Austrian-born philosopher by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein. He is part of the generation that were young adults during World War I. And so there's a number of astoundingly important German-speaking philosophers who had the experience of being soldiers on the German side during World War I, and their response to the horrors of what they saw informs a lot of their thinking. The most important of those people is probably Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian. He comes up with a very different construct of how to talk about God that will sound more like process in a lot of ways, but it's a different construct in which God is not really powerful. But because that's not the point in his theology, but it's part of his response to the war and the horrors of the war. Wittgenstein, one of those people, becomes important in what's called the Vienna Circle, which was a group of people in Vienna who eventually developed the approach to philosophy that emphasizes language. And so Wittgenstein is known especially for a concept that a phrase he coins, language game. And it's a really kind of useful way of understanding how social contexts work, that in a particular context, people talk a certain way because they're involved in a certain project that has certain sort of intrinsic limitations to it, and how they understand it and where they are in society, it gives them a certain way of talking. And so there is a language game. So like when you're doing theodicy, there is a language game to theodicy. There are sort of particular things that you need to cover, that you need to know about. And in order to be conversant and participate in the conversation, you have to know the language game of theodicy. You could say, he would say the same thing about going to the grocery store, that you need to know the language game of the grocery store. How is it that you relate to the clerks? How does the checkout thing work? And all of that there are these implicit kind of rules about how things work, which is kind of like a game in a lot of contexts, and you need to learn those and know those. So it's Wittgenstein makes a lot of this idea, and he's one of a few people in philosophical history who actually have a kind of dynasty that's established after them. Hegel would be another person like that. So Wittgenstein had a very important student by the name of Peter Winch, who was English, I think English, definitely, well, British somehow, but I think English. And Winch was interested in taking Wittgenstein's ideas into philosophy of religion. And he became very important early, well, kind of early mid 20th century figure. Then Winch had a student, a very, very promising student by the name of D.Z. Phillips. So D.Z. Phillips was Welsh, and he was one of the people I took classes from when I was in Claremont. He had half of the year he was in Wales at a university called Swansea, and half of the year he was in Claremont, because he was that big a deal that he had two university appointments. What Phillips ends up with is a different kind of postmodern philosophy, in which the emphasis of everything is in which he wants to see everything through the languages of these language games. And it ends up, I think, as a philosopher who's not part of that school, I found him very frustrating, because he doesn't want to really make truth claims. He'll make language game claims. And philosophy at one level is kind of supposed to be about truth claims. So he can seem at times kind of squirrely in what he's doing and where he's going. And it's always kind of playful. He was just his personality. He was a remarkably playful kind of guy. He got along very well with the students when he was in town, and he was always trying to teach the new students who are coming in how to play cricket, because that was an important thing to know. everyone should know how to play cricket. And he was not very successful at that. We only very rarely did any of us actually figure out what the hell was going on with cricket, even though we would try, in deference to him because he was so charming. So I definitely, I think I would say I loved this man. He was charming and caring and decent and very frustrating. D.Z. Phillips. So, so reading through this, there's not a lot that leaps out that actually means much, unfortunately. But he talks a lot and he sounds good when he says it. Like on 24 in the second paragraph that begins on that page anyway, it says Roth does not consider the possibility that God's only sovereignty is the sovereignty of love, which is like the construct of an open theology. You know, that what if this power construct you're making is actually just wrong, and this is going out, it's really something else. But we also get this point out where he's commenting on an idea that Roth developed, that God is also disappointed with how human life has turned out. You know, that we look around and see the carnage of human history and are disappointed, and this is part of that view, is that God also looks at it and goes, Jesus, people, what are you up to? This is very disappointing. You need to do better. But why God doesn't change that, you know, that's part of God only knows. All right. So
Was that, Richard?
Yeah.
Was that the purpose of the flood? Was that God was so disappointed in us?
Exactly. That's the Noah story. God was disappointed, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, God was disappointed. So there are references to this. God's disappointed all the time. Comes up all the time.
And does evil things as a result.
Well, it can't be evil if God did it, though. See, remember, that's you have a divine command theory. It's not evil if God did it. It's like Trump and being president, right? If the president did it, it's legal. God did it.
My mind is exploding.
These ideas come from somewhere. So, let's see. Then Griffin, David Ray Griffin. Griffin, I didn't have a class with him. I attended some lectures once in a while that he gave. So I got to know him a little bit. He just entered hospice here a couple months ago. So all of these guys are old enough now that half of them have died and the other half are getting very old. You know, D.Z. Phillips had a heart attack in the library stacks in Swansea. They didn't find him for a couple hours even. It was, you know, but he died doing what he loved doing. He was doing research in the library. Let's see. So one of the things I think that Griffin brings up is that implicit in Roth's position is the idea that God can also kind of grow in terms of how our moral thinking works, and can over time change and do things differently. And one of Griffin's responses is, everybody's watching the game, I guess. One of Griffin's responses is, why would you think that? I don't see where's that come from? So that pulling things out of the air point. So he's pushing back on that idea.
It is 1 o'clock, past 1 o'clock.
Oh, it's my problem, isn't it? I'm forgetting how long class goes.
I can listen to you forever, but I know.
I was thinking, we ended at 12:30 last quarter, right? So I have the half hour is in my head when I look at the clock. Well, it's not the half hour yet. Sorry, you're right. It's 1. Okay, I'll wrap this up next time and then we'll go into the next chapter, which is, what's the next one? Oh, is Hicks. So we'll talk about Irenaeus. Whoa. Okay. Have a good day, everyone.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.